I saw a guy at a coffee shop the other day who looked like he was having a genuine internal crisis. He had just spilled a tiny, and I mean tiny drop of oat milk on his tie. He spent the next 10 minutes frantically dabbing at it with a napkin, glancing around the room with a panic, "Did anyone see that?" expression. His face was flushed and he sat there stiffly for the rest of his meeting, convinced that every person in the building was staring at that nickel-sized damp spot and judging his lack of basic coordination. To him, it was a neon sign screaming incompetence to the entire world. He was the lead actor in a tragedy titled The Ruined Morning, and he was certain the audience was horrified. It's a feeling we all know intimately. That invisible burning spotlight that follows us after we tell a joke that doesn't land or send an email that was probably 3 sentences too long. We live as if we are the protagonists of a grand production, assuming the world is a giant audience watching our every stumble with popcorn in hand. We relive the stupid things we said at dinner, certain that everyone else is reliving them too. But then there is the data. In 1999, researchers conducted a study where they forced a student to wear a socially suicidal t-shirt featuring a massive, unironic photo of Barry Manilow and walk into a room full of his peers. The student was mortified, absolutely convinced that his reputation was incinerated and that every single person had clocked the shirt. The reality. Less than 20% of the people in that room even noticed he was wearing anything unusual. They weren't judging him. They were too busy worrying about their own hair, their own grades, or the texts they'd forgotten to send. That crushing weight of judgment he felt, the same one you feel when you trip on the sidewalk, was a total hallucination. Realizing that you are not the main character in everyone else's story is initially a bit of a blow to the ego. It feels a little lonely to realize you're just a minor player in someone else's film, but if you look closer, it is the most liberating get-out-of-jail-free card you will ever receive. The spotlight isn't just dim, it was never actually on. And once you realize the stage is empty, you finally have permission to do whatever you want.
The data reveals that this discrepancy between the internal perception of visibility and the external reality is not just a temporary quirk. It is a deeply ingrained, structurally predictable cognitive bias.
Right.
This phenomenon is empirically defined in the psychological literature as the spotlight effect. It operates on the foundational principle that human cognition is fundamentally anchored in its own phenomenological experience.
Meaning we only really know what we feel.
And the baseline experiments conducted in 1999 rigorously quantified the exact dimensions of this distortion. Examining that initial study with the Barry Manilow t-shirt provides a very clear blueprint of the mechanics.
Yeah, that study is wild.
The target participants were placed in a highly specific engineered scenario designed to maximize acute social embarrassment. They were instructed to put on the garment and enter a room where a group of their peers was already seated, engaged in filling out questionnaires.
And just to paint the picture for you, if you are the person wearing that shirt, walking into a silent room full of college students, your heart is pounding. I mean, you feel the fabric on your chest. You are entirely consumed by the physical reality of the shirt. You basically feel like a walking punchline.
That intensity of internal, physical, and emotional reality dictates the predictive model the participant generates. After the target student sat in the room for a designated period, the researchers removed them and asked a crucial question.
Right, they asked them to guess how many people noticed.
They asked, what percentage of the people in that room do you believe noticed the image pictured on your chest? The targets, still consumed by the acute embarrassment, predicted on average that 46% of the observers would be able to recall the shirt.
Which is nearly half the room.
Yes, nearly half.
Which, feels entirely logical to them in that moment. If you feel like the sun is shining directly into your eyes, you assume everyone else is squinting too.
That is a very accurate assessment. The empirical reality, however, demonstrated a severe cognitive miscalculation. When the researchers surveyed the individuals who had been sitting in the room, only 23% actually noticed the shirt or could recall the image.
Wow.
The target individuals had overestimated their salience by a factor of exactly 2.
How do we know this is a psychological hallucination? Like, maybe people are just genuinely terrible at observing their environment.
That is a common initial hypothesis.
Right, because maybe humans just don't look at each other's clothes that closely, and the person wearing the shirt just didn't know the baseline statistics on human visual memory.
The methodology anticipated that exact critique. To isolate the mechanism and prove that this overestimation was not simply a general misunderstanding of human observation, researchers implemented a highly specific control group.
Okay, what did the control group do?
These control participants never wore the Barry Manilow shirt. Instead, they were brought into a separate, neutral environment and shown a videotaped reenactment of the exact procedure from the perspective of an outside observer.
So they're basically watching a VHS tape of some poor kid walking into a room wearing the embarrassing shirt.
Correct.
They see the layout of the room, they see where the other students are looking, they see the whole geometry of the social interaction.
Exactly. The control group observed the duration of the exposure, the sightlines, and the general orientation of the room's occupants. Then, the researchers asked this control group the identical question.
How many observers in that room do you estimate noticed the shirt?
And without the internal visceral anchor of actually wearing the garment, the control group's estimates aligned almost perfectly with the actual 23% accuracy rate.
Okay, let's translate what that actually means, because the implications of that control group are massive. It proves that our brains actually do know how the world works.
Effectively.
When we are sitting on the couch watching a video of someone else, we possess the capacity for objective, highly accurate social observation. We know that people are distracted, that they are looking down at their papers, that they aren't paying attention. But the absolute second we become the subject of the observation, the moment the shirt goes over our own head, that objective logic completely dissolves. Our feelings hijack our math.
The internal state of the individual actively warps their predictive modeling. The emotional volume of the experience overwhelms the rational assessment of the environment.
But I have to push back a little here, because a Barry Manilow shirt is explicitly designed to trigger shame. And shame is a very loud, very panicky emotion.
Yes.
It makes sense that shame would scramble our logic. What if we remove the embarrassment? What if we look at situations where we actually want people to look at us? Does this cognitive bias disappear when we feel confident?
The subsequent phases of the 1999 research addressed that exact variable. And the data shows that the bias applies equally, if not more severely, to positive self-presentation.
Really? More severely?
Yes. The research paradigm was flipped. Instead of forcing participants into a socially suicidal garment, the researchers allowed participants to select a t-shirt featuring an individual they actively admired and felt a deep sense of pride in displaying.
Right, so they gave them options like Bob Marley, Jerry Seinfeld, or Martin Luther King Jr. figures that carry cultural cachet or intellectual weight.
The psychological posture of the participant completely shifts here. They are no longer trying to shrink into the background. They are broadcasting an identity they're proud of.
The desire to hide is replaced by a desire to be seen.
Yet the underlying cognitive distortion remained identical in its architecture. When asked to estimate the observation rate, the participants wearing these positive, self-selected shirts predicted that 48% of the observers in the room would notice.
Basically the exact same prediction as the embarrassing shirt, about half the room.
Yes. However, the actual accuracy rate of the observers in this positive iteration plummeted to a mere 8%.
Wait, 8%?
Only 8%.
That is an incredible drop. They thought half the room was admiring their Bob Marley shirt, and the reality was less than 1 in 10 people even registered it. They overestimated their positive visibility by a factor of 6.
This specific data point completely dismantles the notion that the spotlight effect is exclusively a byproduct of shame, social anxiety, or the fear of ostracization.
It's just about being focused on yourself.
The distortion is tied entirely to self-focus, irrespective of the emotional valence. Whether an individual believes they are broadcasting an agonizing flaw or an admirable trait, they operate under the profound delusion that their personal broadcast signal is exceptionally strong.
It's like we think we are transmitting on a massive high-wattage radio tower, but we don't realize that the receivers in the surrounding environment, the people around us, are mostly tuned to their own internal frequencies.
That is a highly accurate analogy. The sheer magnitude of the disconnect in the positive iteration underscores a critical reality about human interaction.
Which is
that observers are profoundly absorbed in their own cognitive landscapes. The target participant feels a deep sense of identity, alignment, and pride in the image they have selected. This elevates the shirt's salience within their own immediate
right.
They then project that heightened salience outward, operating under the assumption of a shared psychological reality.
Okay. Assuming a shared psychological reality, let's unpack that for a second, because that feels like the root of so many human misunderstanding. Are you saying we just basically believe that our internal movie is the exact same movie everyone else in the room is watching?
In the psychological literature, this maps onto the concept of naive realism.
Naive realism.
Naive realism is the deeply held, often unconscious assumption that one's own perception of an object, an event, or a social dynamic is an accurate, objective and unfiltered reflection of reality.
And if I see it that way, everyone else must too.
Exactly. The dangerous corollary to naive realism is the assumption that because our perception is objective, any other rational human being in the vicinity must perceive it in the exact same way.
So because the Bob Marley shirt feels incredibly important and loud to me in this exact second, it must be an objectively loud feature of the room. I perceive it as a dominant feature of the environment because it is a dominant feature of my brain's current workload.
Correct. The cognitive load of the target is dedicated to the shirt. The cognitive load of the observer, however, is dedicated to entirely different stimuli.
Like what they're having for lunch.
Their own impending deadlines, their own mild hunger, the ambient temperature of the room, or their own internal anxieties.
Wow.
The spotlight effect is essentially a systemic failure of perspective taking. It is an inability to fully and accurately decouple our own vivid, high-definition internal state from the theoretical, highly distracted internal states of the people around us.
I hear the t-shirt data and I totally understand the visual disconnect. I mean, it is easy to miss a static image on a piece of clothing. It just requires a visual scan and a tiny bit of memory retention, which people clearly aren't bothering to do.
True.
But I have a hard time buying that this phenomenon applies cleanly to things we actively say or do. A static image is passive. But what about active behavior? Do people also overestimate how much their actual words or dynamic actions are judged?
It is a vital distinction to make.
Because if I am sitting in a meeting and I'm just wearing a weird tie, you might not look at me. But if I raise my hand, open my mouth, and actively stutter, or if I make an argument that makes zero sense, I am forcing you to pay attention to me.
You are demanding auditory attention.
Right. I am demanding the auditory and cognitive attention of the group. Does the spotlight effect survive that level of active engagement?
The empirical analysis addresses this exact distinction through dynamic group interaction studies, moving away from passive visual stimuli and into the realm of complex verbal behavior.
Okay, how do they test that?
To test active behavior, researchers assembled groups of individuals who were previously unacquainted and tasked them with discussing a highly charged, multifaceted topic. Specifically, they were asked to debate the problem of the inner cities.
Oh, wow, that is not a light conversation. That requires participants to navigate issues of race, class, economics, and public policy, all with complete strangers.
The environment was deliberately engineered to generate friction. They had 20 minutes to debate these complex issues, and the mandate was that they had to conclude the session by drafting a unified consensus policy statement.
So they have to agree at the end?
Yes. This setup guaranteed the production of both highly articulate, persuasive arguments and inevitable speech errors, awkward phrasing, or potentially controversial statements. The cognitive load on the participants was immense.
Right, because you were trying to sound smart, you're trying to read the room, and you were trying not to accidentally offend anyone, all in real time.
Following the expiration of the 20-minute discussion, the researchers separated the participants and asked them to engage in a comprehensive ranking exercise.
Ranking each other.
Participants were asked to rank themselves and then rank every other peer in their group across both positive and negative dimensions.
Give me some examples of the dimensions. Like, what were they ranking?
Positive dimensions included questions such as who advanced the discussion the most, or who provided the most structurally sound arguments. Negative dimensions included who made the most speech errors, or who made the most socially awkward or offensive comments.
Ugh, this is where the paranoia really sets in. You are sitting there after the fact, agonizing over every word you just said.
The data yielded a highly consistent, highly illuminating pattern regarding internal prediction versus external reality. Participants vastly overestimated the prominence of their own active contributions across the board in both directions. Yes. If a participant felt they had articulated a particularly brilliant synthesis point that single-handedly drove the policy statement forward, they assumed the rest of the group recognized that brilliance and would rank them highly for that specific positive contribution.
They basically thought they were the hero of the meeting.
Conversely, if a participant stumbled over a sentence, lost their train of thought, or made a comment they immediately feared was slightly insensitive, their internal alarm bells triggered.
Right, the panic.
They predicted that the group would rank them exceptionally harshly for those specific localized blunders.
When the researchers cross-referenced how I thought I did with how my peers actually ranked me, what did the peer rankings reveal? Because if I made a terrible point, surely they noticed.
The peer rankings revealed that the spotlight was, once again, largely a projection of the individual's internal state. The correlation between how a participant thought they were perceived and how they were actually perceived was consistently disparate.
Wait, did anyone notice the brilliant points?
The brilliant points were indeed registered by the group, but they were not recorded with the singular defining magnitude the speaker assumed.
Ah.
The speaker viewed their own brilliant point as the climax of the 20-minute session. The peers viewed it as one useful data point among dozens.
Okay, that makes sense for the positive stuff. But what about the mistakes?
More importantly, when analyzing the negative dimensions, the awkward stumbles, the speech disfluencies, the perceived offensive remarks, the data showed that these blunders were largely lost in the relentless, chaotic flow of the conversation.
So the stutter that was literally keeping me awake that night didn't even register on their radar? Why, are they just being polite in their rankings?
It is not a matter of politeness. It is a matter of cognitive bandwidth.
Bandwidth, okay.
The other participants in that circle were entirely consumed by the exact same internal pressures as the target. They were too focused on formulating their own next counter-argument, managing their own physical presentation, and attempting to analyze the broader, complex topic of urban policy to meticulously log the minor social infractions of their peers.
So they're too busy worrying about their own performance to judge mine.
The individual who agonized over a poorly phrased sentence was reacting to an intense, deafening internal alarm that the rest of the room simply did not possess the processing power to hear.
The spotlight effect survives active behavior because we fundamentally misunderstand how little attention other people have left in their mental bank accounts.
A very apt summary.
Our active behaviors, much like our passive clothing, command significantly less of the overall social bandwidth than our internal experience insists they do.
That is the empirical baseline. The phenomenon exists, it operates across visual and auditory domains, and it applies to both pride and shame.
But establishing that the bias exists is only the first step. For you, the listener, understanding that you overestimate your visibility is helpful. But the real power comes from understanding the exact machinery inside your head that produces this hallucination.
The underlying mechanisms are crucial.
Why does the human brain so reliably fail to perceive social reality accurately? I mean, it feels like an evolutionary glitch. We rely on social cohesion to survive, so why would our brains constantly feed us false data about how the group perceives us?
The neurological and cognitive mechanics driving this failure are deeply rooted in a well-documented heuristic process known as anchoring and adjustment.
Anchoring and adjustment.
To understand the spotlight effect, we must understand how the human brain calculates estimates in the absence of objective data.
Okay, anchoring and adjustment. Let's create a concrete analogy for this. It's like haggling for a car, right? If you walk onto a dealership lot and the salesperson slaps a sticker on the windshield that says the car costs $50,000, they have just set an anchor. You might negotiate furiously. You might argue, point out flaws in the engine, and eventually get them to drop the price to $40,000.
Yes.
You drive off the lot feeling like an absolute master negotiator because you adjusted the price down by 10 grand. But what you don't realize is that the car cost the dealer $15,000. Your brain anchored to their starting number, and while you did adjust downward, you didn't adjust nearly far enough to reach the actual objective reality.
That is an excellent framework. The brain utilizes an initial piece of readily available information, the anchor, and then attempts to course correct the adjustment to reach a plausible conclusion.
So how does that apply to the spotlight?
In the context of social interaction and the spotlight effect, the anchor is not a price tag. The anchor is our own intense, immediate phenomenological experience.
So if I drop a tiny bit of oat milk on my tie in the coffee shop, my internal alarm goes off. I feel the dampness. I feel the embarrassment. My brain sets the starting price, the anchor, at 100%. I fundamentally feel like 100% of the room is currently looking at my tie.
Exactly. Your initial internal anchor is set at absolute maximum visibility. Now, as a rational adult, you possess the intellectual understanding that the entire coffee shop is not actually looking at you. You know that other people have their own lives.
Right.
So your cognitive process begins the adjustment phase. You begin to negotiate the number downward in your mind.
Like, okay, the guy in the corner is reading a book, so he didn't see.
Right.
The barista's steaming milk, she didn't see, so maybe only 50% of the room saw.
And that is where the cognitive failure universally occurs. The adjustment phase is almost structurally guaranteed to be insufficient.
Because the anchor is too strong.
You adjust downward from your 100% anchor, but you stop the negotiation far short of the actual empirical reality, which might be close to 0%. You cannot fully escape the gravitational pull of your own immediate experience.
It's like my brain simply cannot wipe the slate clean and look at the room objectively. I am forever tethered to the fact that I know the stain is there.
To explicitly trace and verify this specific anchoring and adjustment mechanism, researchers designed a brilliant iteration of the T-shirt paradigm. This time, they utilized an image of the 1990s pop icon Vanilla Ice.
Classic.
The core methodology remained identical. Targets wore the shirt, interacted with observers, and were then asked to estimate the percentage of people who noticed. But the researchers added a critical line of inquiry during the debriefing phase.
What did they ask? They didn't just ask for the final number. They asked how the target arrived at the number, right?
Yes. After the targets provided their final estimate, they were interrogated about their cognitive sequence. The researchers explicitly asked, "Did you consider any other numbers or percentages in your mind before settling on your final estimate?"
Okay.
The data extracted from this inquiry provided direct evidence of the heuristic at work. 73% of the participants explicitly admitted that they had indeed considered other numbers before arriving at their final answer.
They were actively haggling with themselves.
Crucially, of that group who considered alternative numbers, 77% reported that the initial number they considered was higher than their final estimate.
Boom, there is the anchor.
This provides direct, self-reported evidence of the anchoring and adjustment pathway. They anchored on an initial, extremely high number, a direct reflection of their own intense self-awareness of the Vanilla Ice shirt, and then they consciously, rationally adjusted downward.
But not enough.
But their final estimate, while lower than their initial spike of panic, still vastly overshot the actual empirical reality of the observers in the room. They negotiated down, but they didn't negotiate down far enough.
This mechanism becomes even more fascinating and undeniably validated when we look at what happens when you manipulate the intensity of the anchor itself.
Indeed.
If this entire hallucination relies on the sheer strength of our own internal awareness, then logic dictates that if we can artificially lower our internal awareness, our estimate of external judgment should drop right alongside it.
This introduces the psychological concept of habituation into the spotlight effect.
Right, habituation. If you wear a loud, scratchy neon sweater for 10 seconds, it's all you can think about. But if you wear it for 3 hours, you forget you have it on.
Yeah, exactly.
The physical and psychological novelty wears off. Your brain stops actively flagging the sweater as a point of crisis and accepts it as the new normal.
Researchers tested this dynamic by splitting the T-shirt participants into two distinct groups. The physical stimulus, the embarrassing shirt, remained identical for both. The first group donned the shirt and was instructed to immediately walk into the room of observers.
So they're fresh.
They were operating with a fresh, high-intensity internal anchor. Every nerve ending was firing.
They were walking in while the price tag was still flashing $50,000 in their minds.
The second group, however, put on the exact same shirt but was given a different instruction. They were told to sit entirely alone in a separate quiet room for 15 minutes. The purpose was to allow them time to acclimate to the garment before ever encountering a single observer.
They habituated to the fabric, the image, the reality of wearing it.
So by the time they walk into the observation room 15 minutes later, the internal alarm bells have quieted down. The anchor has naturally lowered itself.
The starting price dropped. What did the numbers look like?
The data showed a significant measurable divergence in their estimations, based purely on this temporal delay. The immediate group, operating with the fresh anchor, estimated that 51% of the observers would notice the shirt.
And the delayed group?
The delayed group, whose internal anchor had naturally lowered through the process of habituation, estimated that only 37% would notice.
Let's really highlight what that means. The external reality did not change a single fraction. The physical shirt was the exact same. The room of observers was the exact same. The lighting, the layout, the social dynamics, all identical.
Completely identical.
The absolute only variable that changed in that entire experiment was the target's internal phenomenological state.
As the internal anchor lowered in intensity, the estimation of external judgment lowered in perfect lockstep. This proves conclusively that our perception of external scrutiny is tethered directly to our internal physiological and psychological state, not to the objective environment.
If we step back and connect this to the broader spectrum of human behavior, we realize that this cognitive architecture extends far beyond external traits, spilled oat milk or embarrassing garments.
It governs internal traits as well.
Right. The spotlight effect governs how we believe our physical, visible exterior is perceived. But there is a parallel, deeply related bias that governs how we believe our hidden internal emotional states are perceived.
You're referring to the illusion of transparency.
Exactly. Because our internal feelings, whether it is intense anxiety before giving a speech, the guilt of telling a lie, or the physical sensation of disgust are so overwhelming and loud to us, we falsely believe that these internal states are somehow leaking out through our pores.
We think they are readily legible to anyone looking at us.
Right.
The mechanics are identical to the spotlight effect. We anchor on the extreme intensity of our internal emotion, and we insufficiently adjust for the absolute opacity of our physical exterior. We assume our face and body language are transmitting a high-definition broadcast of our internal state.
Give me some examples of where this illusion of transparency shows up in the data.
Consider high-stakes negotiations. When individuals are placed in negotiation simulations operating with hidden preferences or secret bottom lines, they consistently, measurably overestimate how much of their strategy they have inadvertently signaled to their opponents through body language or hesitation.
They believe their internal calculations are transparent.
Similarly, individuals instructed to actively lie or deceive others in laboratory settings consistently overestimate how obvious their deception is to observers. They feel their racing heart and assume the observer can see it.
They feel like Pinocchio, assuming their nose is growing with every word, when externally their face is completely still.
In a particularly vivid and slightly amusing demonstration of this, researchers asked participants to consume deeply foul-tasting, bitter liquids while attempting to maintain a perfectly neutral facial expression.
Oh man, that is a brutal experiment. You drink something terrible, your entire body wants to gag, but you have to keep a poker face.
The targets were absolutely convinced that their visceral, biological disgust was glaringly obvious to the researchers observing them. They anchored on the intense sensory shock on their palate. They assumed their micro-expressions were betraying them.
And what did the observers see?
In reality, the observers watching them were largely unable to differentiate when the participants were drinking sweet, pleasant water versus the bitter, foul solutions. The targets felt their internal revulsion was a flashing neon sign when physically it registered on their face as barely a flicker.
And this illusion of transparency isn't just a quirky lab trick. It has profound and, frankly, deeply dangerous sociological implications when we apply it to group dynamics.
Yes.
For you listening, if you've ever studied psychology, you are likely familiar with the bystander effect. We look at tragedies or emergencies and wonder how a crowd of 30 people can witness smoke filtering under a door or see a person slumped against a building on the sidewalk and just keep walking. How does a crowd do nothing?
The illusion of transparency is a critical driving component of this collective inaction. It creates a phenomenon known as pluralistic ignorance.
Let's break down exactly how pluralistic ignorance happens, step by step, using the illusion of transparency. Imagine you are walking through a busy train station. You witness an ambiguous event. Maybe someone drops a bag and slumps against the wall.
An ambiguous emergency.
Right. They might be having a heart attack, or they might just be exhausted and resting. Your internal state immediately spikes with panic and uncertainty. Your heart rate elevates, your brain is screaming, "Is this an emergency?"
However, deep societal conditioning dictates that we must maintain composure in public spaces. We are terrified of appearing hysterical, foolish, or overly dramatic if the situation turns out to be innocuous.
We do not want to be the person who pulls the fire alarm for a burnt piece of toast.
Therefore, you instinctually mask your internal panic with a perfectly calm, neutral exterior. You stand still and you glance around the room to gauge the reactions of the other bystanders to see what they are doing.
And here is where the cognitive trap snaps completely shut.
The individual knows definitively that they are terrified internally, despite presenting a calm exterior. But due to the illusion of transparency, they assume that a portion of their hidden panic must be visible. They think, "I am so scared, surely people can tell I am concerned."
Yeah.
Simultaneously, they look at the other bystanders. Those bystanders are engaged in the exact same process, experiencing internal panic, masking it with a calm exterior, and looking around.
You look at a stranger, you see their blank face, and you fail to apply your own logic to them. You know you are faking being calm, but you assume the stranger's calm exterior is a genuine reflection of a calm internal state. You think, well, that guy isn't panicking, so he must know something I don't. It must not be an emergency.
Everyone in the room is actively masking their terror, and everyone simultaneously assumes that everyone else's mask is the objective reality. Pluralistic ignorance takes complete hold of the group. The emergency is ignored, and the tragedy occurs not out of malice, not out of apathy, but out of a collective, tragic misinterpretation of internal states driven by this precise cognitive bias.
Fine. It means our assumption that people can read our feelings can actually lead to paralysis in life or death situations. But this raises a really fascinating question about the boundaries and limits of this phenomenon.
Yes, the extremes.
We have established that hypersensitivity to our own state, whether it's an embarrassing shirt or internal panic, creates the spotlight effect. But what occurs when habituation progresses past a 15-minute delay? What happens when it progresses to an extreme degree over years? What happens when an individual is no longer conscious of their own behavior at all?
The data points to a precise, mathematically predictable inversion of the bias, the reverse spotlight effect.
The reverse spotlight effect. So instead of thinking everyone is looking at us, we think no one is.
When an action, a physical trait, or an environmental factor becomes so deeply routinized that it slips entirely beneath the threshold of conscious awareness, the internal anchor we discussed drops effectively to zero.
Because they don't even notice it themselves anymore.
Because the individual is no longer consciously registering the behavior or the stimulus, they systematically and drastically underestimate how noticeable it is to the surrounding external environment.
We've all experienced this. Think about the person on the morning subway commute who is playing a game on their phone with the sound on, completely oblivious to the daggers being stared at them by 30 other passengers. Or think about the classic empirical examples. Individuals who smoke heavily, or individuals who apply excessive amounts of heavy cologne.
The physiological and cognitive mechanics are identical in those scenarios. Consider the heavy smoker. Over thousands of repetitions spanning years, the individual has completely habituated to the scent of the smoke.
Their nose is basically blind to it.
Their olfactory receptors have downregulated their sensitivity, and their cognitive attention no longer flags the scent as novel or noteworthy. The smoke has become the baseline environment.
So when they finish a cigarette, step into an elevator, and stand shoulder to shoulder with 3 non-smokers, what is their brain doing?
They're operating from an internal anchor of absolute zero awareness. Because they cannot smell the smoke, their anchor dictates that the smell is negligible. Therefore, they vastly, almost comically underestimate how invasive, overwhelming, and immediately detectable their physical presence is to the non-smokers trapped in that confined space with them.
The person bathed in half a bottle of heavy cologne experiences the exact identical deficit. They sprayed it on at 7 a.m., habituated to it by 7:15 a.m., and by the time they walk into a 2 p.m. meeting, their anchor is at zero, while everyone else in the room is suffocating.
The overarching cognitive mechanism anchoring and adjustment remains identical in all these scenarios. The critical variable is the starting value of the anchor. A high anchor, driven by acute self-awareness, dictates that we suffer from the paralyzing overestimation of the spotlight effect.
And a zero anchor.
A zero anchor, driven by chronic habituation, dictates that we suffer from the oblivious underestimation of the reverse spotlight effect.
We have dissected this extensively in the sterile, controlled environment of clinical labs, t-shirt paradigms, and hypothetical subway rides. But to truly grasp the immense tangible weight of this cognitive bias, we have to transition out of the lab and into the high-stakes, real-world environments where it inflicts the most structural damage to our lives. Let us examine the modern corporate workplace.
The organizational implications are profound.
Imagine this scenario and put yourself right in the center of it. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead casts a sterile, unforgiving, slightly yellow glow across a massive, cold mahogany conference table. You are sitting rigidly in a low-backed, highly uncomfortable chair. The synthetic fabric of your suit is scratching against your neck.
A high-stress environment.
Directly across the table sits your department manager. They are silently tapping a heavy silver pen against a leather folio. This is the culmination of your quarter. This is the performance review. Internally, you are trapped in a state of absolute sensory and cognitive paralysis. Your heart rate is elevated, drumming a frantic, irregular rhythm against your ribs. Your palms are sweating.
The physical symptoms of anxiety are acute.
But what is truly fascinating is where your brain is allocating its processing power. Your entire cognitive capacity is funneled entirely backward in time, fixated on 2 singular, excruciating memories. First, a presentation you delivered 3 months prior, where you lost your place on a slide, stumbled over a crucial financial projection, and paused for perhaps 5 seconds of agonizing, dead silence.
Burns.
Second, An email you sent to the entire department last Thursday containing a glaring, embarrassing typographical error in the subject line. In your mind, sitting in that chair, these two events are not minor blunders. They are towering, neon-lit monuments of incompetence.
The anchor is incredibly high.
You are absolutely convinced that this entire quarterly review is going to be a systematic, brutal dismantling of your professional worth, viewed exclusively through the lens of that 5-second stutter and that missing comma. You brace for the physical impact of the criticism. You are reading every slight shift in your manager's posture, every prolonged blink, every pause in their speech as absolute confirmation of your profound, irredeemable failure.
The analytical reality of that specific interaction provides a textbook, almost tragic demonstration of the spotlight effect's destructive capacity within organizational behavior. We must contrast the employee's internal state with the manager's actual cognitive load.
Right. What is the manager actually thinking about while tapping that pen?
While the employee is locked in a downward spiral of excessive self-criticism, anchored entirely to their perceived historical blunders, the manager's cognitive bandwidth is distributed across an entirely different, vastly broader spectrum.
They aren't thinking about the typo?
No. The manager is likely glancing covertly at the clock on the wall, calculating the remaining minutes before they have to present to an executive steering committee. They are mentally reviewing the overarching quarterly revenue metrics for the entire 50-person department, attempting to synthesize macro trends. They are not agonizing over the granular historical communication missteps of a single subordinate.
The anchor is entirely asymmetrical.
Completely. The specific stutter from 3 months ago and the typographical error from last week, the very things consuming 100% of the employee's mental bandwidth, long since been overwritten in the manager's memory architecture.
Buried under everything else.
They have been buried by dozens of subsequent operational challenges, budget constraints, and personal stressors. The employee's absolute terror of stepping into a harsh, imaginary spotlight creates a profound psychological misalignment in the room. And this misalignment is not benign. It is deeply toxic.
So?
It actively hinders employee growth, creates artificial barriers to team communication, and distorts the trajectory of the individual's career.
Exactly. The fallout from this internal narrative is not just a sweaty palm during a meeting. It creates a pervasive, chronic performance anxiety that fundamentally alters how that individual navigates their daily work. Think about the behavioral changes. When an individual genuinely believes that every single action, email, and comment is being hyper-scrutinized and permanently recorded by their peers, their primary objective in the workplace radically shifts.
They stop trying to excel.
Their goal is no longer innovation, contribution, or excellence. Their primary goal becomes pure self-preservation.
Risk-taking is systematically extinguished from their behavioral repertoire.
They will refuse to volunteer for high-visibility projects. They will sit in a brainstorming session, possess a slightly unorthodox but potentially brilliant idea, and actively choose to withhold it, terrified that if it fails, the failure will be broadcast globally. They will avoid stepping up for leadership roles.
The perceived cost of failure is too high.
Because their broken cognitive anchor tells them it will be witnessed, mocked, and judged by the entire organization. That perceived cost vastly, overwhelmingly outweighs the potential reward of success.
It is crucial at this juncture to distinguish this specific operational paralysis from a related but fundamentally different psychological construct, narcissism. In corporate environments, the individual who is constantly worried about how they are perceived is frequently and incorrectly labeled as narcissistic by untrained observers.
Right, because on the surface, both the spotlight effect and narcissism involve an intense fixation on the self. You are thinking about yourself constantly. So what is the dividing line?
The dividing line is the fundamental motivation driving the self-focus. Narcissism is characterized by an inflated, grandiose sense of self-importance and a ravenous, insatiable desire for external attention.
They want the spotlight.
The narcissist actively demands the spotlight because they genuinely believe they're the only actor worthy of the stage. They want the illumination. The spotlight effect, conversely, is driven purely by the fear of negative judgment.
It's an anxiety response, not an ego response.
Exactly. The individual suffering from the spotlight effect does not want the attention. They feel violently trapped by it. They are acutely, painfully aware of their own flaws, and they falsely project that intense awareness onto their colleagues. They're trying to escape the stage, not command it.
So If we accept this reality, if this is a hardwired evolutionary cognitive bias, if the human brain is structurally predisposed to anchor on its own phenomenological experience and mathematically fail to adjust for the perspective of others, how on earth does an organization fight back? How do you manage a workforce of thousands of people when the primary barrier to collaboration and innovation is a shared, silent, neurological hallucination happening inside their individual skulls?
Organizational psychology provides concrete, structural interventions to mitigate this bias at a systemic level. You cannot rewire the human brain, but you can alter the environment to neutralize the trigger. The primary and most effective antidote to the spotlight effect in a corporate setting is rigorous reality testing.
Define reality testing in a business context. Like, what does that look like?
The anxiety of the spotlight effect thrives in the dark. It multiplies in the absence of objective external data. When an employee does not know what management is thinking, their brain fills the void with their worst fears. Therefore, organizations must implement systems of regular, highly specific, and deeply constructive feedback.
So the annual review isn't enough.
Relying solely on an annual or even a quarterly review cycle is disastrous. It leaves too much temporal space months of silence for the employee's internal narrative to distort reality and inflate minor errors into career-ending catastrophes.
So if my boss tells me exactly what I'm doing well and exactly what I need to fix every single week, I don't have to spend the other 4 days of the week guessing what they think of my email typo.
Continuous feedback loops ground the employee in objective, undeniable performance metrics. It eliminates the cognitive requirement for them to guess how they are perceived. When an employee is explicitly told what is actually being noticed and valued by the organization, the imaginary terrifying spotlight loses its power. The anchor is replaced by actual data.
What else can leadership do beyond just talking more often?
Organizational leadership must actively shift the structural operational focus away from granular individual metrics and toward collective team goals. Remember, the spotlight effect is fueled by intense, isolated self-focus. By structuring projects, financial incentives, and performance evaluations around team achievements and collective output, the organization structurally dilutes that self-focus.
The spotlight gets wider so it feels less hot.
Exactly. When the cognitive anchor is tied to the group's overall trajectory rather than the individual's micro-behaviors, the paralyzing fear of personal, isolated scrutiny is significantly reduced. Furthermore, there's immense value in leadership modeling vulnerability.
Showing their own mistakes.
Yes. Normalizing open dialogue about these precise psychological pressures, having senior executives openly discuss their own mistakes and how quickly they were forgotten, creates a culture of empathy. It systematically dismantles the illusion of relentless, flawless scrutiny.
If the workplace represents the everyday chronic friction of the spotlight effect, the low-grade fever that just makes life a bit harder, we must also examine its most paralyzing, acute extreme. When this exact cognitive bias is amplified by underlying psychological vulnerability, it ceases to be a mere hindrance to career growth and mutates into a profound clinical pathology, social anxiety disorder.
A very serious condition.
To observe this transition from an abstract corporate bias to visceral physical suffering, we travel to a sidewalk in a bustling, brutally cold Chicago neighborhood. A young man named Elias stands outside a crowded, independent coffee shop. The ambient noise of grinding espresso beans, the clattering of ceramic mugs, and overlapping rapid-fire conversations filters through the heavy glass door.
Just a typical morning.
To a typical patron is the comforting sound of a morning routine. To Elias, it sounds like an active threat. His physical body is in full revolt. His fingers are physically trembling, gripping a crumpled $5 bill so tightly the skin over his knuckles is stark white. He is not there for caffeine. He is currently engaged in a highly specific, engineered, shame-attacking exercise prescribed by his cognitive behavioral therapist.
The classic exposure technique.
His explicit, terrifying task is to walk up to the counter and confidently order a completely nonsensical, slightly embarrassing beverage. A medium well-done iced latte.
That is intentionally absurd.
For you or me, this might be a goofy dare. For an individual with chronic social anxiety, this is not a mild discomfort. It is a forced descent into a psychological inferno. As he finally pushes open the heavy door, his sympathetic nervous system triggers completely. The fight-or-flight response floods his veins. He feels the phantom heat of dozens of eyes physically locking onto his skin.
The physical sensation of the spotlight.
He approaches the register, and as he forces himself to stammer out the absurd order, his throat tightens. His voice cracks a high-pitched, humiliating break that feels, in his own ears, as loud as a fire siren. He is entirely hopelessly consumed by the anchor of his own humiliation. He is convinced, down to his very cells, that the entire shop has halted its morning routine to witness and mock his degradation.
The clinical utility of this specific exercise, the reason therapists prescribe something so seemingly cruel, lies entirely in the exposure to the objective reality that immediately follows the perceived climax of humiliation. The therapeutic mechanism requires the buildup, but it hinges on the release. Let us examine the environment's actual reaction. The barista standing across from Elias is a tired college student wearing a stained canvas apron, likely operating on a severe sleep deficit, worrying about an impending midterm exam. Her cognitive bandwidth is entirely depleted.
She does not care about his order.
She does not burst into theatrical laughter. She does not summon the manager or announce the absurdity of the order to the crowded room. She barely even makes eye contact with Elias. She simply responds with flat, exhausted mechanical efficiency. "We don't do that, man. You want an iced latte or not?"
The ultimate anticlimax.
Elias stammers an agreement, pays, and retreats to a small, wobbly table in the far corner of the shop. His sympathetic nervous system is still flooded with adrenaline, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. The secondary phase of the therapy instruction dictates that he must remain at that table and actively observe the environment for 20 minutes.
The data collection phase.
Yes, the data collection phase of this reality testing is immediate, visceral, and irrefutable.
What does he see when he actually forces himself to look at the audience?
He watches the patrons. Not a single person turns their head to look at him in the corner. No one is whispering behind their hands. The line continues to move with steady momentum. The surrounding conversations regarding midterms, weekend plans, and weather do not miss a single beat.
They are completely oblivious.
The burning spotlight he had felt physically pressing down on him, dictating his actions for a decade, is revealed in real time to be a complete, localized hallucination generated entirely by his own hyperactive amygdala.
The mechanics of cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, are brilliant here. They utilize these exact exposure exercises because they attack the cognitive distortion at its absolute root. Think about how counterintuitive this therapeutic objective is. If you have a friend who is incredibly anxious about what people think of them, your natural instinct is to comfort them. You want to tell them, "Don't worry, everyone loves you, you are charming, you are funny, your interactions are totally fine."
Which is, clinically speaking, the entirely wrong approach.
Exactly, because that approach simply validates the underlying toxic premise. It validates the idea that everyone is actually watching you, but tries to spin the judgment as positive. It keeps the spotlight turned on. The actual cure provided by CBT, the mechanism that creates lasting relief, is the cold, bracing, and ultimately deeply liberating realization that Elias is, to the vast majority of strangers on this planet, completely and utterly irrelevant. He is background noise.
The exposure therapy structurally forces the patient to generate the highest possible internal anchor of shame, ordering a well-done iced latte, and then forces them to directly confront the absolute zero of the external reaction. By repeatedly, systematically experiencing this massive, undeniable disconnect between internal panic and external apathy, the neurological pathways in the brain begin to physically rewire. The cognitive habit of assuming observation is broken.
It builds a very specific kind of resilience.
It fosters profound self-compassion by forcing the patient to recognize their common humanity. It is the sudden realization that every other person in that bustling coffee shop is trapped in their own complex, messy internal narrative. They're all too burdened by their own immense cognitive loads to spare even a fraction of their processing power for a stranger's awkward moment at the register.
It is incredibly powerful to see CBT cure this in adults. But it also feels like a tragedy that we have to wait until someone is in their 20s suffering from panic attacks in Chicago to deploy these interventions. Rather than waiting until adulthood to use clinical exposure therapy or structural corporate overhauls to combat this debilitating bias, a far more elegant systemic approach would involve dismantling the spotlight effect at the absolute root during the critical developmental window of childhood.
A preventative approach.
What if an entire society tried to teach this before the anxiety hardened into a disorder? To observe this paradigm shift in action, we must analyze the highly innovative educational interventions currently being integrated into the school systems in Japan.
The cultural context is critical here.
Scene. We are in a suburban junior high school located just outside the sprawling metropolis of Osaka. The educational environment here is heavily structured around deeply ingrained communal rituals, specifically the concept of kyushoku, the standardized school lunch program. This is not just a time to eat. It is a highly choreographed pedagogical exercise designed to foster communal responsibility and group cohesion.
It is a vital part of the curriculum.
The classroom is intensely quiet, save for the synchronized sounds of 30 students eating in uniform rows. Suddenly, the pristine silence is shattered by a violent, echoing crash. The sharp clatter of a plastic tray hitting the hard linoleum floor rings out. 12-year-old Hana freezes in place, completely paralyzed. A dark, spreading stain of spilled miso soup inches across the floor near her shoes.
An intensely stressful moment for a student.
In a Western educational culture, this is embarrassing. But in a Japanese educational culture that places an immense foundational premium on the maintenance of absolute group harmony and the highly valued, subtle social skill of reading the air to avoid any form of disruption, this accident feels apocalyptically bad. Hana keeps her head bowed low, her face flushing a deep, painful crimson. The spotlight effect hits her like a physical weight.
Her anchor is at maximum.
She is absolutely certain, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that every single one of her 32 classmates has stopped eating, is staring directly at her, and is permanently etching this moment of profound clumsiness into their long-term assessment of her character.
The spotlight effect in this scenario is exponentially magnified by the intense cultural expectations of seamless social integration. The friction between her internal mistake and the external expectation of harmony creates an incredibly high internal anchor.
And this wasn't an isolated moment for her. For weeks prior to this soup incident, Hana had been operating under the exact same crushing fear. She avoided raising her hand in math class. She hesitated during reading exercises, completely terrified that a wrong answer or a mispronounced word would single her out and make her the odd one out. She was living in a constant state of hypervigilance.
A state that severely limits educational growth.
But the turning point for Hana doesn't come through discipline, and it doesn't come through a therapist's office years later. It occurs through a highly structured, systemic classroom intervention. Later that week, a school counselor newly and extensively trained in specific social-emotional learning protocols enters Hana's classroom and introduces what appears to be a very simple, almost childish drawing exercise.
The simplicity is the mechanism.
The instruction given to the students is minimal but profound. Every student in the room is asked to draw a visual representation of their own personal spotlight. They are asked to draw the specific moments where they feel most intensely watched, judged, and scrutinized by their peers. The exercise is a brilliant psychological tool because it requires the children to externalize their hidden, internal phenomenological anchor onto a piece of paper.
When the drawings are completed, collected, and anonymously displayed on the front board, the revelation provided to the students is immediate and profound.
Hana looks up at the board, dreading seeing her own spilled soup mocked. Instead, she sees 32 distinct variations of the exact same image. She sees 32 separate drawings of her classmates feeling trapped under a burning, critical glare for their own incredibly minor imperfections. One student drew themselves sweating over a mispronounced English vocabulary word. Another drew themselves agonizing over a stuffed sneaker. Another over a bad score on a minor quiz.
The universal nature of the illusion is revealed.
The relief Hana experiences in that moment is not a sudden, joyous, jumping out of her seat epiphany. It is a quiet, heavy, deeply grounding realization. The rough edge of this psychological truth is that her peers weren't watching her spilled soup with harsh judgment. They weren't watching her at all. They were entirely, desperately consumed with guarding their own fragile perimeters of social safety. They were far too busy monitoring the heat of their own imaginary spotlights to ever notice hers.
This localized, deeply effective classroom intervention reflects a massive, systemic evolution currently underway in Japanese educational policy regarding social and emotional learning, commonly referred to as SEL. To understand how a counselor knew to deploy that specific exercise, we must briefly trace the history of SEL implementation in Japan.
Where did it start?
The foundational architecture was laid in the 1990s, characterized by various fragmented psychoeducation programs that focus primarily on basic assertion training and practical life skills. However, the conceptual framework was permanently and fundamentally altered in 1999, which is, fascinatingly, the exact same year the initial Barry Manilow t-shirt studies were published in the West.
A global convergence of realizing we need to study how we think about ourselves.
Indeed. In 1999, the KSEL guidelines were officially introduced to Japanese educational researchers. CASEL, an acronym for the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, provided a highly rigorous, evidence-based, structured architecture for explicitly defining and implementing social-emotional competence in schools.
So they finally had a framework.
However, historically, the primary structural challenge in integrating these concepts into Japanese schools has been deeply bureaucratic. The MEXT, the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science, and Technology, which dictates the national curriculum, had long issued broad guidelines emphasizing philosophical concepts like cultivating a zest for life and deep empathy among students.
But no actual instruction.
Exactly. They conspicuously and consistently lacked the explicit terminology, the targeted funding, and the structured step-by-step methodology of formalized SEL. It wasn't until the highly significant 2020 revisions to the National Student Guidance and Counseling Manuals that the exact term and the rigorous concepts of SEL were explicitly integrated as universal mandatory programs for all students.
That's a huge shift.
This marked a profound shift in the national paradigm, moving from reactive counseling, waiting until a student like Hana was in crisis, to proactive systemic cognitive training for the entire population.
That is a beautiful philosophy, but I have to push back hard on the reality of it. This raises a massive, almost insurmountable logistical nightmare for teachers. Schools, whether you are in suburban Osaka or downtown Chicago, are already pushed to the absolute breaking point. The daily curriculum is relentlessly, exhaustingly packed with advanced mathematics, science, language arts, and the ever-present pressure of standardized testing preparation.
A time constraint is real.
How do you actually functionally inject complex psychological training teaching 12-year-olds to recognize and systematically dismantle cognitive biases like the spotlight effect into an incredibly rigid national curriculum without breaking the entire educational system? You cannot simply carve out a dedicated hour for a Cognitive Bias 101 class every Tuesday. There are literally no hours left in the school day to give.
You have identified the exact friction point that historically dooms SEL programs globally. The solution devised and refined by educational researchers in Japan is a highly integrated, system-oriented approach known conceptually as anchor point planting. This approach directly utilizes the pre-existing nested structure of the Japanese school curriculum.
So it's woven in.
Rather than treating SEL as an isolated, distinct subject competing for time, it is strategically and seamlessly woven into the existing daily fabric of the school environment across three highly distinct piers.
Break down the tiers for me. How does anchor point planting actually work on a Tuesday?
Tier 1 is designated as Area A. This consists of the few existing classes that are already directly aligned with SEL objectives, such as special activities periods or the mandatory moral education classes.
Yeah.
In Area A, dedicated explicit time can be spent introducing core concepts, such as the spotlight drawing exercise Hana experienced. This establishes the vocabulary.
Fine. What about the rest of the day?
That leads to Area B, which is arguably the most critical. Area B involved the deliberate, structured integration of SEL terminology and exercises into standard, rigorous academic subjects. For example, during a highly complex collaborative mathematics project, the math teacher does not just grade the final equation.
What else do they grade?
The teacher explicitly instructs the group to actively utilize specific emotional regulation or perspective-taking skills when inevitable disagreements arise over the problem-solving method. They practice dismantling the spotlight effect while arguing about fractions.
That is brilliant. And the last tier.
Finally, there is Area C. Area C represents the vast environment outside the explicit academic curriculum, morning assemblies, recess periods, and the highly structured daily communal cleanup times characteristic of Japanese schools. In Area C, all teachers and school personnel are trained to observe and reinforce these cognitive skills in real time.
Praising them in the hallways, basically.
Praising students when they successfully manage their anxiety, navigate a social conflict without retreating, or demonstrate empathy toward a struggling peer. The psychological training becomes the ambient atmosphere of the school.
Okay, I love the elegance of that nested structure, but let's unpack the research methodology behind it. Because proving that this invisible woven structure actually works to reduce anxiety is incredibly difficult. You cannot easily run the gold standard of scientific research, randomized controlled trials, or RCTs in a functioning, chaotic middle school environment. It's not a sterile lab where you can control every variable.
The appropriateness of utilizing strict RCTs for broad SEL research in real-world educational settings is highly debated among methodologists due to the near impossibility of eliminating powerful confounding variables. If you attempt to randomize two separate schools, giving one the SEL program and withholding it from the other, The ultimate success or failure of the intervention might have absolutely nothing to do with the SEL curriculum itself. The variance in anxiety reduction might be driven entirely by the specific, charismatic leadership style of one school's principal, the nuanced, highly developed pedagogical skills of a few key classroom teachers, or their pre-existing complex teacher-student dynamics. These human variables severely contaminate the raw data.
And frankly, there are profound ethical concerns, right? If you genuinely believe this program cures crippling anxiety and prevents students from suffering, you can't just ethically withhold it from a control group of children for 4 years just to get a clean data set.
Exactly. Therefore, the preferred, highly robust methodological approach utilized in contemporary Japanese SEL research relies on sophisticated quasi-experimental designs, specifically weightless control trials.
Weightless control trials, how does that fix the ethics?
In this specific research model, the designated control group does not receive the psychological intervention initially, which establishes a crucial, clean baseline for statistical comparison. However, they are ethically guaranteed to receive the full, comprehensive treatment protocol immediately after the initial experimental group completes their session.
Okay, so everyone gets the help eventually.
Yes. While methodologists acknowledge this design carries a slight theoretical risk of overestimating intervention effects, the rigorous, relentless accumulation of evidence through replication running these waitlist trials across hundreds of highly varied school environments, from rural villages to dense urban centers, provides a highly reliable, deeply actionable metric.
And what does the data say?
The data overwhelmingly confirms that these nested SEL structures effectively reduce generalized social anxiety and successfully dismantle paralyzing cognitive biases like the spotlight effect before they calcify into adult pathologies. The comprehensive analysis of the data, spanning from the empirical origins of the cognitive bias to its structural societal remedies, presents a remarkably clear and unified narrative. The spotlight effect is not a personal failing, nor is it a symptom of vanity. It is a universal, neurologically hardwired illusion. It is a structural flaw in human perception, caused by the overwhelming, inescapable anchor of our own conscious experience.
It's just how we're built.
The empirical evidence rigorously demonstrates how this mechanism of insufficient adjustment warps our perception across all domains. It dictates how we view our passive physical appearance, how we judge our active dynamic behaviors, and it convinces us, through the illusion of transparency, that our hidden internal states are broadcast globally. We see the profound destructive friction of this illusion manifest in the paralyzing performance anxiety of modern corporate boardrooms, where the fear of imaginary scrutiny actively extinguishes risk-taking and innovation.
It's everywhere.
We see its agonizing physical extreme in the physiological panic of social anxiety in the streets of Chicago, and we feel its immense cultural weight in the quiet lunchrooms of Osaka. Yet the data also provides the exact blueprint for liberation. Whether the chosen intervention is the implementation of rigorous reality testing and continuous feedback in the corporate workplace, the deployment of targeted exposure therapy in clinical CBT to force a confrontation with public apathy, or the weaving of nested social-emotional learning into the daily fabric of Japanese schools, the core mechanism of the cure remains fundamentally identical. The remedy to the spotlight effect is the rigorous, empirical, and repeated realization of the illusion itself.
Never forget that you are not the main character, and that's your superpower.